On the night of the 10th of January, 1992, 12-year-old Shanda Sharer was doing what thousands of children across America did every weekend. She was at home, watching television. Her father had already gone upstairs to bed, believing the night was over. Then came a knock at the front door. 2 teenage girls stood outside. They smiled politely and said a friend wanted to see her. Nothing about the conversation seemed urgent. Nothing seemed dangerous. Shanda slipped on a different set of clothes, quietly walked out of the house, and climbed into their car. She never came home. Just 10 hours later, 2 brothers on their way to go hunting spotted a body by the side of a road north of Madison, Indiana. A discovery that would horrify an entire state. The victim was so badly injured that investigators couldn't immediately identify who she was. But this isn't simply the story of what happened during those 10 hours. It's the story of everything that happened before them. Because the warning signs had been there for months. Threats had been made in public. Teachers knew. Classmates knew. Her parents knew enough to move her to a new school. It didn't keep her safe. Over the next few hours, you'll see how an ordinary teenage rivalry spiraled into one of America's most disturbing crimes. Why 4 teenage girls crossed a line from which there was no return, and how this tragedy could have been stopped. Not once, but several times. This is the story of Shanda Sharer. And before we begin, it's important to remember one thing. She wasn't a true crime story. She was a 12-year-old girl who loved basketball, enjoyed making friends, and had her whole life waiting for her. Before Shanda Sharer became the victim in a murder investigation, she was simply a 12-year-old trying to fit in. Friends described her as cheerful, outgoing, and mature for her age. She loved basketball, enjoyed meeting new people, and, like many children her age, looked up to older teenagers. That desire to be accepted would unknowingly place her in the middle of a conflict she didn't fully understand. In the autumn of 1991, Shanda began spending time with Amanda Heverin, a 14-year-old student she had met through school. But Amanda had recently ended a relationship with an older girl named Melinda Loveless. For Melinda, by then 16, the breakup wasn't just painful, it became an obsession. Those who knew her later described a teenager struggling with deep emotional scars, growing up in a home marked by instability, violence, and neglect. None of that excused what she would eventually do, but it helps explain how rejection quickly turned into anger and anger into fixation. To Melinda, Shanda wasn't simply another girl. She became the symbol of everything Melinda believed had been taken from her. The first public warning came at a school dance in October 1991. Witnesses watched as Melinda confronted Shanda in front of other students. The message was unmistakable: stay away from Amanda. It wasn't a private argument hidden behind closed doors. It happened in public where classmates saw it unfold. And it didn't end there. Over the following weeks, the threats became more frequent. Some were delivered face to face. Others were written down. Friends heard them. Students talked about them. Amanda would later say she gathered up Melinda's threatening letters and handed them to a youth prosecutor. Nothing was done. As the situation escalated, Shanda's family grew increasingly worried. They made the difficult decision to move their daughter to a new school, hoping a fresh start would put the conflict behind her. For most families, that would have been the end of the story. A fresh start. A safer environment. But Melinda wasn't interested in letting the conflict end. She wanted to know where Shanda had gone. Eventually, she found out. The new school wasn't enough. Even a weekend away at her father's house wouldn't be enough. Because while Shanda's family believed they had finally put danger behind them, Melinda had already begun gathering people willing to help her carry out a plan. At first, according to investigators, the idea wasn't murder. It was revenge. A plan to scare a 12-year-old girl. But over the next 24 hours, that plan would spiral into something none of them could ever take back. On the night of the 10th of January, 1992, 12-year-old Shanda Sharer was at home with her family in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Her father and stepmother had already gone to bed, leaving Shanda downstairs watching television. She had no reason to believe that anything unusual was about to happen. But outside her home, a group of teenagers had already made a decision that would change countless lives forever. That night, Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey arrived at Shanda's house. They told her that Amanda Heavrin was still at a place known locally as the Witch's Castle, an abandoned stone structure surrounded by rumors and urban legends. Shanda was hesitant. Something about the situation made her uncomfortable. But after changing her clothes, she eventually agreed to go with them. It was a decision that would lead her into a nightmare. As Shanda got into the car, Hope Rippey began asking questions about her relationship with Amanda Heavrin. The conversation quickly turned from curiosity into an interrogation. Then, without warning, Melinda Loveless emerged from the back seat. She placed a knife against Shanda's throat. Loveless began questioning her about her relationship with Amanda. The group drove toward Utica and the abandoned location known as the Witch's Castle. During the drive, Lori Tackett told the girls about the legend surrounding the building. According to the story, the location had once belonged to 9 witches, and townspeople had burned it down to destroy them, leaving only a small stone structure behind. Inside the Witch's Castle, the situation became even more terrifying. Shanda was crying and frightened as the girls restrained her. Loveless continued to intimidate her, making cruel comments designed to frighten her. She took Shanda's jewelry and handed the items to the others. At one point, Hope Rippey took Shanda's Mickey Mouse watch and danced as it played music. The details revealed during the investigation showed a disturbing pattern. Shanda was not only being harmed, she was being humiliated. Eventually, the group left the Witch's Castle. During the drive, Shanda repeatedly begged them to take her home. But instead of returning her to safety, they continued driving. At one point, they became lost and stopped at a gas station. To avoid being seen, Shanda was covered with a blanket. While one of the girls went inside to ask for directions, another made phone calls and spoke casually with others, never revealing that a terrified child was trapped in the vehicle. Eventually, the group arrived near a wooded area close to Madison, Indiana. There, they went to an abandoned building located along a logging road. 2 of the girls remained in the car, frightened by what was happening. But Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett took Shanda inside. What followed was a prolonged attack that would later shock investigators, the community, and the entire country. The evidence revealed that Shanda was beaten and seriously injured inside the abandoned building. At different points, the other girls became involved. Despite moments of fear and hesitation, none of them called for help. Instead, they participated or remained silent. Eventually, Shanda was placed in the trunk of the car. The girls believed she was dead, but she was still alive. They then drove to Lori Tackett's nearby home. Instead of seeking emergency help, they went inside. They cleaned themselves, drank soda, and acted as if they had just returned from an ordinary night out. But then they heard something coming from the trunk. Shanda was still alive. As the sun began to rise, the teenagers made one final decision. They drove to a gas station, purchased gasoline, and headed north of Madison toward a rural area near Lemon Road. There they carried Shanda into a field. Even after everything that had already happened, they made another choice. They set fire to her. Later that morning at approximately 9:30 a.m., the girls went to McDonald's for breakfast. They laughed and spoke about what had happened. As the sun rose on the 11th of January 1992, the people of southern Indiana began another ordinary morning. But along a quiet rural road near Madison, Indiana, a discovery was about to expose one of the most disturbing crimes the state had ever seen. That morning, brothers Don and Ralph Foley were driving toward Jefferson Proving Ground to go hunting. As they traveled along the road near Lemon Road, they noticed something unusual lying on the roadside. At first, they believed it might be a mannequin or some kind of abandoned object. But when they stopped and approached, they realized the horrifying truth. It was the body of a child. At 10:55 a.m., the brothers called police. Officers were immediately sent to the scene, and the investigation into the unknown victim began. State Trooper David Cam, Jefferson County Sheriff Buck Shipley, and detectives arrived and began collecting evidence. At first, investigators did not believe they were looking at a crime committed by local teenagers. Their early theories focused on other possibilities, including the idea that the victim may have been connected to a drug-related incident. The reality was far more shocking. The victim was a 12-year-old girl from New Albany, a child who had disappeared the night before. Investigators examined the scene carefully. They found evidence suggesting that the person responsible had intentionally attempted to prevent the victim from being identified. The circumstances surrounding the body showed that this was not a random act of violence. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide what they had done. But investigators still did not know who the victim was. Earlier that morning, Shanda Sharer's father, Stephen, realized something was wrong. His daughter was missing. At first, he called friends and neighbors, hoping she had stayed somewhere overnight or gone to see someone she knew. But as the hours passed and no one had answers, the fear grew. At 1:45 p.m., Stephen contacted Shanda's mother. The two parents met and reported their daughter missing to the Clark County Sheriff's Office. At that moment, authorities were investigating the death of an unidentified child. They did not yet realize the two cases were connected. The breakthrough came later that evening. Around 8:20 p.m., Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey arrived at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office with their parents. Their decision to come forward would change the entire direction of the investigation. But their statements were not ordinary witness accounts. They were confused, emotional, and filled with details that raised immediate suspicion. During questioning, they identified the victim as Shanda. They also named 2 other girls who had been involved, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett. Slowly, investigators began piecing together what had happened the previous night. Authorities now had a possible identity for the victim. They contacted officials handling Shanda's missing person report. The connection was confirmed. The burned body discovered on the side of the road belonged to 12-year-old Shanda Sharer. A family's worst fear had become reality. Investigators obtained Shanda's dental records, which provided the official identification. The case was no longer a search for a missing child. It was now a murder investigation. And the suspects were not unknown criminals hiding in the shadows. They were 4 teenage girls from the local community. Based largely on the statements provided by Lawrence and Rippey, investigators moved quickly. On the 12th of January 1992, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett were arrested. The prosecution immediately announced that they intended to pursue trying both girls as adults. The case that had begun with the discovery of an unidentified child had transformed into a national story. As investigators uncovered the truth behind Shanda Sharer's murder, the case moved from a search for answers to a question of justice. The 4 teenagers involved were arrested and charged, but the court was faced with a difficult decision. How should the justice system respond when those responsible for such a horrific crime were still teenagers themselves? Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett, who were identified as the main perpetrators, were tried as adults. Loveless pleaded guilty to murder and related charges and was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Tackett also received a 60-year sentence after pleading guilty to murder and other charges. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence reached plea agreements after providing information that helped investigators reconstruct the events of that night. Their sentences were significantly reduced compared with those of Loveless and Tackett. But while the legal process brought accountability, it could never undo what happened. A 12-year-old girl had lost her life. A family had lost their daughter. And a community was left trying to understand how a group of teenagers could become responsible for such a devastating crime. More than 30 years later, her name continues to be remembered. Not because of the tragedy that took her away, but because her life mattered. This was the story of Shanda Sharer.